How credible is the United Nations? UN Secretary-General Ban Ki-moon has left the Israeli regime off the annual UN list of parties which injure or kill children during armed conflicts. Yet, in the summer of 2014, Israel killed around 600 children. Despite this, Israel is not included in the annual report, perhaps in part because of threats by US senators to UN funding should Israel be included. Furthermore, the United Nations has recently criticised America's atrocious human rights record, but the US is still not complying. It's as if America is immune to the kind of sanctions Washington itself proposes for other countries committing similar violations. Meanwhile, although the UN Security Council has passed a resolution to place an arms embargo on the freedom fighters in Yemen, known as the Ansarullah movement, they have done no such thing against the regime doing the bombing, Saudi Arabia. This adds to a growing global perception that the UN is biased, corruptible and, as far as fairness is concerned, irrelevant. For example, Syria has urged the UN to take decisive action against Turkey, which is a key pathway for weapons to reach ISIL terrorists in Syria. If the UN refuses to act, some believe this would spell the beginning of the end in many countries for any credibility that remains with the UN. Why has the UN refused to respond to Israel's record of killing children? How are we to interpret threats to UN funding from a pro-Israeli American senator? And why has the UN Security Council proposed an arms embargo against the freedom fighters in the Yemen, but not against Saudi Arabia's military aggression? These are the simple and searching questions we sought to answer. And here's another one. The UN recently condemned America for its atrocious human rights record, but the US is still not complying. Why has the UN not acted tough against the US? We pose that puzzle to the American public.
Probably because the main office of the U.S. is in the UN is in the United States, so they don't want to make their landlords mad. You know, it's a tough one, and it's politics and it's personal stuff. I'm not privy to all the details, so I can't go any further than that.
I think the U.S. is a big power within the UN. So they're sort of hard to discipline in that matter. They've also, the U.S. has also sort of described themselves as like the police force of the world, essentially. So I think that sort of makes it difficult to crack down on the U.S. Yeah.
I have no idea, but they absolutely should. I do not understand that and never will.
It's all power politics, really. They can't do anything.
That's a really complicated question, mostly because we fund it for a number of reasons. But I guess funding would probably be the number one. It's also located here, so that makes it a little difficult.
That's what the public told us. Why does the UN appear lenient regarding America's human rights abuses? We put that mystery to our experts.
Well, the important thing to understand about the United Nations is that it was formed as part of a package of institutions by the United States at the end of the Second World War to ensure US hegemony, US leadership, US power around the world. The other institutions were the International Monetary Fund, the banking system, the dollar peg, the fact that the dollar was the world's major currency. So the United Nations, despite the veneer, the outward image of it being some kind of democratic body, in fact has been, if not an instrument of the United States policy, it's been designed so that the UN cannot move against United States policy. This is the reason why they have the Security Council with the veto for the United States on decisions made. And so this is part of a long history of at points the United Nations passing or coming up with reports which condemn the United States, but no action is taken because the entire body is designed so that it cannot act in opposition to the interests of the United States.
I think it's fair to say that the United Nations and the people who work at the United Nations are very much scared and intimidated by pressure that is exercised by the US. We know for a fact that the US grinding machine actually applies incredible pressure on those who work at the US, threaten them with having their jobs, taking away their jobs, threaten the countries actually that they represent with sanctions and all sorts of other forms of intimidation. So people who work at the UN, are actually genuinely scared of in any way ruffling the feathers of the United States. And we're seeing time and time again in the way that UN officials work and constantly actually accept the pressure that is applied to them by US officials.
A US senator has warned that UN funding could be cut if the UN criticises Israel. What do you make of these kinds of threats? That's what we asked the public.
Kind of a pacifist kind of guy, so I don't think anybody should be threatening anybody. Everybody's an individual, and if that's what certain people want to do, like, that's what they have to do. Like, they have the right to support who they want. I don't like threats at all.
I think it's wrong. I think it's wrong for someone to curtail funding, but then again, at the same time, you know, he who pays the piper calls the tune. So that's the reality of the situation, but I think it's wrong.
I am flabbergasted about that. I mean, Israel should be criticized by all means. You know, what about Palestine? What about them? What about the Palestinians? Should they be criticized? I don't think so.
I think it's a little unfair that we can do such a thing in terms of cutting funding. You know, I think once again it comes down to really political ties with how the U.S. works with Israel. You know, in that sense.
How should we interpret threats to UN funding were it to make negative comments about Israel? Here's what our experts said.
This is part of a long history of the United States and also Britain using their veto power, and in the case of the United States also the funding that it gives the United Nations as a weapon to prevent any criticism of Israel. So repeatedly there have been moves to condemn Israel for the apartheid wall, for the deaths aboard the Mavi Marmara 5 years ago, for the attacks upon the people of Gaza, for the illegal occupation since 1967 of the West Bank, and many, many other things. And so what the US Senator is doing is not an aberration. This has actually been US policy. At various points, the US has withheld its payments to the United Nations, which of course is situated in New York. Because it's situated in New York, even the United States has used its immigration powers to prevent people from coming to the United Nations. They did this against Abu Ammar, against Yasser Arafat in the 1970s, when he was unable to visit the United Nations. So what I make of this is that it's a further example which hopefully will open more people's eyes to the ineffectiveness of the United Nations as a body, and the fact that the United States has a veto both politically and economically upon what the United Nations does.
Well, for one hand, this explains that Israel is not only a close ally of the US, but it's almost one and the same. We're seeing that a US senator, a US lawmaker, rather than actually exercise pressure on an international body for the interests of the US or for the interest of Americans, is actually threatening the United Nations on behalf of a foreign nation. Now, this is unprecedented. And it actually shows beyond the close relationship that today Israel has with the US. Of course, this is absolutely astonishing that this is straightforward blackmail from somebody, from an official, from the official representative of a government, actually threatening an international body that is there to represent international law, that is there to some extent fairly represent the interests of the international community, and say that we will cut funding providing you actually don't comply when it comes to Israel. This is astonishing, but of course it confirms what so many people have been saying for so many years, which is that not only the US is with Israel one and the same, but of course it is willing to apply the worst possible ways of applying pressure, such as blackmail, against international bodies in order to get the results that they want. And of course, naturally, we've seen that Israel has been in violation of over 65 UN resolutions with nothing happening to it. It hasn't suffered any forms of sanctions. It hasn't suffered any form of boycott. It continues to enjoy all the benefits of being a state that is fully respectful of international law, whereas of course we know that it is the most, it's the country that actually violates the most international resolutions, and all this precisely because it benefits from the unwavering support of the United States.
Despite killing around 600 children in the summer of 2014, Israel has put the UN Secretary General under pressure, who has now refused to include Israel on the list of parties that kill children. What's the reaction of the American public?
That international relations are always incredibly complicated, and that oftentimes they function more on pragmacy than on emotion or human rights.
He should be probably guillotined on the 14th of July in the middle of Paris.
You think it's pretty bad, huh?
It is pretty bad. It is horrible.
It's not good. That puts everyone, I guess, in a difficult position. I'm not sure why they haven't taken that sort of action. And I guess that puts too much power in the hands of Israel because they can get away with that sort of thing, which no country should have that kind of control.
I think, again, that's not really fair. Like, humanitarily, that's unfair, to do that. And I think killing 600 children is morally wrong, no matter how you dice it up. No matter what race or ethnic background people are killing 600 children, today. Like, that's ludicrous.
Well, if kids are getting killed, then they have to be put on the list. I mean, no child deserves to be killed at all, let alone hurt in any way. So, yeah, they definitely need to be put on the list if they're killing kids for whatever reason.
Israel remains excluded from the list of parties that have demonstrably killed children. How should we interpret Israel's exclusion from that list? Our experts gave their view.
Well, the current UN Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, is one of the worst UN Secretary Generals that we've ever had. There have been previous UN Secretary Generals who have at least been prepared to appear to be independent, to criticise Israel, to criticise the United States and its allies and so on, whereas this one came in precisely because he was seen to be a friend of the United States. So I'm afraid to say that the bureaucracy of the United Nations has got worse over the years. There was a time when you could talk about clashes between the UN and the US, at least verbally. Now those are few and far between because the influence of the United States extends right into the office of the Secretary General himself. And Ban Ki-moon is nothing but an instrument of US foreign policy.
The reaction is as a human being, I think it's of total disgust. We've all seen the images of children killed. We've seen the images of UN school bombed. We've seen the images of hospital destroyed. And of course, we all remember the striking images of the Bakra boys who were playing football on a beach in broad daylight, where they were deliberately killed by the Israeli army. So the idea that actually Israel isn't deliberately targeting children is astonishing. And of course it's disgusting coming from a body that claims to speak on behalf of the international community. Again, we're seeing how the UN it bows to pressure from the United States and from Israel when it comes to condemning Israeli action. And this is particularly astonishing and saddening to note that all international bodies seem to work under the same premise. Just this very week, we've seen that, for instance, the International Criminal Court has exercised pressure on South Africa to hand over the Sudanese president. Now, this is not to exonerate the Sudanese president of any wrongdoing whatsoever, but we're seeing that on the one hand, when it comes to African countries, African leaders or Arab leaders, the UN or the International Criminal Court exercises pressure that it dares not exercise on people such as Benjamin Netanyahu, on people such as Bush or Blair, who have been in violation of international law and whose criminal activities have actually had consequences on the remaining international community.
The UN Security Council has passed a resolution to place an arms embargo on the freedom fighters in Yemen, but nothing on Saudi Arabia, which is doing the bombing. Is this just a case of double standards or something more sinister?
Oh, it's definitely a double standard. Yeah, it comes down to funding more than anything else.
You think the U.S. is too close to Saudi Arabia?
Probably, yeah, in the long term. I don't think that's going to be a strategic relationship that's going to continue to, provide us with the cheap energy that it did in the past. And so at that point, what are we doing there? There's some real human rights violations that are not things we probably want to be a part of.
I think it's a double standard and something that's been overlooked possibly by them. There's a lot of different, matters in the world that the UN has to attend to, and just seems like, again, something that they've overlooked that should be looked at again and fleshed out a bit more.
It's double standards. It's all about the oil, all about the money. That's it at the end of the day.
I think it's a double standard. I mean, we really don't know what's behind the scenes because politics is just a smokescreen for, what's really going on.
Those are the opinions of the American public about the question of double standards. What do our experts make of the apparent tolerance of Saudi Arabian aggression and opposition to freedom fighters in Yemen at the very same time?
It's double standards, but there's also something important at work here, which is that in order for any serious resolution to pass the UN Security Council, it needs to have the support, or at least not be vetoed, by any of the 5 permanent powers. So the only points at which the UN Security Council is prepared to act is when the perceived interests of those powers coincide. So it's prepared to act over Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait, for example, because the former Soviet Union and the United States were agreed upon that policy. Here, the Russians, the Chinese, British, French and the United States are largely agreed about Yemen in that they may have differences of opinion over the precise detail, but they're agreed that they will be on the side of Saudi Arabia in its imperialist ambition in the area and are prepared to impose an arms embargo on the people of on the freedom fighters in Yemen. And so this is an example of double standards, but not just double standards by the United States, but by all 5 permanent members of the Security Council.
The UN has clearly taken sides in the current conflict that is raging within Yemen. We're seeing 2 parties in Yemen who are Yemeni and who could have been forced to sit around a table and find a peaceful resolution to the raging conflict. But as again we've seen that the UN, which is accepting pressure from nations such as the US, which of course we know is a very, very close ally to Saudi Arabia, has actually accepted to pressure one side and give free will to the other side, which is the Saudi supported party, and to pound indiscriminately Yemeni civilians. So once again, we're seeing that a body whose aim is to provide an international cover of law for those who are oppressed, those who are suffering as a result of conflict, war, boycotts or etc. And yet these countries, these populations are actually suffering at the hands of not only warmongering nations, but are actually obtaining cover from international bodies such as the UN to continue this pressure against these people. And I think the latest example of the UN imposing an embargo on one side on the Yemeni conflict and allowing the other side to indiscriminately bomb civilians pretty much proves that the UN now works essentially for US interests and its allies.
Syria has urged the United Nations to take decisive action against Turkey, which is allowing weapons to get to ISIL terrorists in Syria. If the UN refuses, what would that say about the organisation? We asked the public.
If the UN refuses, I'm not going to be able to answer that question at all. So I'm not versed on it.
I think the U.S. also provides a lot of weapons to a lot of different countries that, whether it's good or bad, our country's making money off of weapons of mass destruction or small arms dealing that's on the black market. It's really tough to combat that. That's something that you can't even avoid. And our country doesn't want to recognize that no matter how we look at it. Our country is benefiting from it and at other people's expenses.
I think it says a lot about the organization that a civil war like that has been going on for 3 or 4 years without them being able to stop it in any way, shape, or form. That's just one real isolated incident. Somebody needs to come up with a comprehensive strategy, and if not them, then who?
It would say that, I just wonder what purpose the UN serves anymore, other than, I don't know, I think they're involved in programs, where they help to feed hungry kids and that kind of thing. But I wonder what purpose do they really serve? If there's no teeth behind your threats, nobody, especially if they know they can get away with something, is going to acquiesce, shall we say, unless there is a serious threat. I'm not saying we should do away with the UN, but you wonder just what the point of it is.
How would our experts interpret a refusal by the UN to act against Turkey's lax attitude regarding arms to ISIL terrorists in Syria? Is what they said.
Well, this is a complete mess from the point of view of the United Nations and from the point of view of the United States. Remember, they said 3 years ago, 4 years ago, that they would bring down the government in Damascus. It would just fall like a house of cards. In fact, the government in Damascus had some support inside of Syrian society. And what rapidly happened is that the uprising inside of Syria became a sectarian uprising, that the most sectarian forces, Al-Qaeda type forces, ISIS forces, came to dominate. Now the United States and UN are not too happy about the ISIS forces. At the same time, they want to remove the government of Bashar al-Assad. So they're caught in a trap of their own making. They are bombing in Syria and in Iraq for their own interests, but they're not prepared to move against Turkey because Turkey is a central ally of the United States, a NATO member in the area, one of the three-cornered alliances the United States has. Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia. And all of the examples that you've asked me about come down to Turkey, Israel, and Saudi Arabia, which are the three pillars of United States imperialism inside of the region. And that's why they're not prepared to act, even though they say that they're opposed to ISIS.
Well, we know for a fact that the US, when it comes to Syria, we know that the US has supported groups such as Jabhat al-Nusra, which are in fact associated to Al-Qaeda, which are themselves a part of the sort of ISIS umbrella. So the US has supported these groups, and the US is obviously a close ally to Turkey, which has not done anything to stop these jihadi fighters trickling and passing through Turkish borders in order to fight in Syria and overthrow the Syrian government. So what this actually says, if the UN refuses to put exercise any pressure on Turkey to stop, to police its borders more thoroughly in order to stop any jihadis traveling from Turkey to Syria, actually means that the UN is supporting the US in its policy to support itself Islamist organizations that are fighting in Syria. So on the one hand, you're hearing that the international community is supposed to come together and fight these various groups that are in Syria and that have formed ISIS, which is described as the most threatening and the most dangerous terrorist organization on the planet. Yet on the one hand, you're seeing that the US and its allies, and in this case it's Turkey, perfectly allowing these groups to come into Syria in order to weaken the only government in the Middle East that is actually thoroughly fighting them. So this ambiguity between what the US is doing alongside the UN really shows that today, once again, the UN is simply some sort of international arm of US's policy.
The UN is supposed to keep the global peace. Instead, many regard it as a pro-Western, overly cautious and even politically corrupt organisation doing little to improve the planet, but actually supporting conditions for oppressors to continue their oppression. For the UN to be respected by the whole world, it must represent the whole world in a balanced way. As things are, the UN stands accused of ideological bias towards the United States and against opponents of America. And to that accusation, it seems the UN has no answer.